God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. It is April 2021, and we have just come out of Easter. And what's amazing about Easter is that we get to celebrate not just the death, but the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that gives us hope for the future. But what about a business? I remember once I was sitting in a place where I was normally reading my Bible at the time. And I looked out in the backyard and there was a persimmon tree. Now, persimmon trees have a lovely orangey red fruit, but in wintertime the leaves fall off the trees and there was just a handful of fruit hanging on the tree, almost like Christmas lights on a dead tree. And I sensed God asked me a question: when is a business dead? Now, I know that when God asks a question, it's not because He is unsure of the answer, but He wanted me to think about it. And I did not want to have the conversation because I thought He might be saying, Brett, the business is dead and it's time to move on. So I avoided the topic for some time, but about 3 weeks later, I think it was, I came back and I asked the question, okay, so when is a business dead? And he said, a business isn't dead until I say it's dead. And so you can have a business that looks lively, that there's a lot going on, but spiritually it's dead, or even economically, practically. On the other hand, you can have something that looks like it's dead, and it's actually still alive. And we need to contend for, stand for that particular business. So in the month of April, we are going to be sharing a month of miracles, and we'll be sharing the miraculous stories of things that have happened in businesses that we've been involved in for decades. So first of all, I want to chat with you about the concept of the resurrection of a business itself. And last year, during the pandemic, the global pandemic with the coronavirus crisis, one of the companies we'd worked with in South Africa, their name is Senna, Sennah, and it's a packaging company that makes equipment for those packaging onions, potatoes, and others in the agricultural space. And with the crisis, their business was in a tough situation. And so the CEO, Hannes, was trying to figure out what could be done. And he thought perhaps we could get some tax relief on our tax bills. And that looked like it was a non-starter. Perhaps we could explore this avenue or that avenue. And basically the advice from accountants, tax advisors, and bankers was declare bankruptcy, the business is dead. Fortunately, one of our colleagues, Errol Smith, has been working with Hannes and Unra Visser out in Paarl, about 50 miles from Cape Town. And Errol was reminded of this saying, a business isn't dead until God says it's dead. And he and Hannes and Andra talked this through. And so then they spent a weekend, Hannes and his wife Andra, in prayer and fasting and seeking God to just say, okay, God, what is your purpose? What is your plan for this business? What is your word? Are you saying it's over, in which case we'll quit? Or are you saying it's not really over? You'll recall the situation where somebody called Jesus and said, please come because my daughter is ill. And Jesus said he would go, and while he was on the way to go to the house of a man by the name of Jairus, servants came along and said, don't bother Jesus anymore, the girl is dead. And Jesus said, she's not dead as you suppose, she's sleeping. Now they thought that he had lost it. But he got there, chased the mourners away, and then prayed for the girl, took her by the hand actually, and said, Talita, which means honey lamb, stand up. And that's just what she did. And Jesus is still able to do the same. And so what was the word? Was it going to be to Hannes and Anra, take the business by the hand, tell it to stand up, or just let it go, prepare for the mourning and the funeral of your business? And Hannes and Anra, the scripture that came to their mind was that of Ezekiel and the dry bones. And just an impossible situation where the prophet Ezekiel actually speaks to a valley of dry bones. I mean, just beyond it. When you've had a barbecue or braai, as we say in South Africa, and the bones have been tossed out, but now it's months and weeks and years later, and the prophet speaks to the dry bones, and they come alive. So the Fissers stood for their business. They prayed, they believed God, and miraculously orders came in. They received orders from past customers. They received orders from new customers. They had to make some modifications to their product. And within a short amount of time, about a month or so, they cleared their backlog of debts and the business was up and running and functional again. What's the point of this? We have to contend for that which God has given to us. Just as Abraham had to chase the vultures and the buzzards and the birds of prey away from the sacrifice that was prepared, so we have to sometimes chase the vultures away from our business and contend and stand for our business. There's an interesting concept in the Old Testament of plunder, and it's a statement of judgment when somebody has come and taken your goods and there's nobody to go and to retrieve the plunder and to get it back. And so in our business, when economic circumstances, the ravages of the economy, pandemics, competition, taxes, other things come and seek to kill our business, don't just say, well, business has its cycles. Yes, that's true, but we also remember that just as we have an enemy of our souls, there's an enemy of your business who wants to steal, kill, and destroy. But Jesus has come to give life and life abundantly. And what I'll do is I'll share the story in their own words from Hannes and Anra Visser, so you can read the story of the resurrection of their business. Now remember, if God did it for them, God can do it for you. So we need to seek God and say, God, in these difficult times, do you want me to lay this down? Do I need to mothball my business? Or do I need to stand in faith, believing that you will do the miraculous? This isn't the first time that we've seen God do this. I remember years ago, there was a couple, she's passed away sadly, but she was running a clothing business. And she'd gone from 600 machinists down to a handful, 20 machinists. And they were in a cash flow difficult situation. And our team prayed with them. And they received an order from a customer they hadn't heard from for many, many years. And they had old inventory of clothing, which is normally just redundant if it's 18 months old. But they were able to make some modifications. And the customer called in and bought all of their inventory. Their business was similarly resurrected. So, can God resurrect a business? You bet He can. He can do that. And we can take a stand for our business. Next thing, the resurrection of products. And I'll tell you two stories here. One is not my story, but it's a wonderful story from a gentleman by the name of Gunnar Olsen. And Gunnar has written a wonderful book called Business Unlimited. I really recommend it because it has story after story, not just of the miraculous, but principles of business that God taught Gunnar and his team. And Gunnar went on to found the International Christian Chamber of Commerce. In one situation, however, his company was making silage bags, and these are the large plastic bags that are used to wrap around bales of hay. You'll see them out in the fields in different countries where you see these rolls of hay and they're wrapped up in plastic. His company was making those plastics. Now what happened one day was that his brother was managing the factory and discovered that something had gone wrong in the production process, and they had made pallets and pallets and pallets of these bags. But instead of the bags having two sheaths of plastic that were separate, somehow molecules had migrated from one side to the other, and this was now just a single sheet of plastic, useless for the purpose. In other words, they were junk. It was something that had to be thrown away. Gunnar tells the story well, but talks about how the fact that they stopped, he and his wife, his family, and didn't pray but asked God, what are you saying? And they felt God was saying that this wasn't his work that had done this, that this was the work of the devil, that if God could raise Lazarus from the dead, what's plastics? Or if God can do a miracle of water into wine, I mean, he's done this stuff before. So they went to the factory a day or so later and saw the thousands of pallets, the whole year's production, prayed over it, and specifically laid hands on all of the pallets. And they tested on Monday, box after box after box, and not one roll of plastic was left sealed one to the other. And I kind of think it would be nice if there was one just so that they could put it up in the museum, but they have the testimony of what God did. So God can resurrect a product. The product was as good as dead. Now you might not relate to silage bags, but one of our friends in Cape Town was the CEO of a winery in Cape Town, and well, just outside of Cape Town in the winelands. And he was a family-owned business. He was one of the youngest CEOs in the industry, and things were going well. But one year in the harvest, they hired in extra help during the harvest season. They hired in a student from a nearby university. And there's a certain fermentation process that takes place. I don't pretend to understand it at all, but the Brix levels or the sugar levels change during this process, and when it reaches a point, they stop that fermentation and the wine goes on to other stages in the production. Once they'd stopped this fermentation process, it was over. Now they moved on to the next stage. Once that happened, the lab tested and found that they did not have wine. They had grape juice. The fermentation had not taken place as it should have. So they called the student in who had been hired, who had been given the particular readings or taking the readings during this cycle. And he'd had a problem on his reading on day one. So he had fudged the results. He'd faked the results, just adjusted the result. They looked textbook perfect, but that's where he got them from, a textbook, not from what was actually in front of him. So now they had a problem. The whole year's harvest was shot. So what did they do? Paul called a fellow director who was a follower of Jesus, and they went into the business on the Saturday, and they prayed, and they asked God to do a miracle. And they again laid hands on each of the vats as they went through. And they prayed that God would miraculously do in no time at all the fermentation process, which had effectively been killed at this point. It was physically impossible for this process to kick off again. On Monday, the labs tested and everything was perfect. God can speak new life into products. God can fix a product development process. This is not the first time he did it. In fact, in the Old Testament, he recommended to Jacob, here's a way in which you can get the sheep to produce the sheep variety that you want through having them mate in front of speckled pieces of wood. So fascinating, God's involvement in the product development process. So God can resurrect a product. We've certainly seen things fixed, like laptops that are broken, hard drives that are shot, overhead projectors. I remember once we were running a training at our home at that time in Saratoga in California. And an overhead projector was sitting up on a stool. Somebody tripped over the cord. It crashed onto the ground. And I immediately went to my laptop to order a new bulb or a new lamp for this projector. And Dina Andrews at the time, who's now Dina Hoffenrichter, looked at me like I was crazy because we hadn't even prayed yet. She said, Brett, we haven't even prayed for this thing. So she laid hands on the projector, turned it on, and the light bulb was fixed. I mean, a physical impossibility. So, next thing I wanted to mention finally is this whole thing of the resurrection of people. Now, we read about this in Scripture. We read about people being raised from the dead. Lazarus is an example, and there were others. And the widow's son. And so we see these examples in Scripture, and we put them out there for a time in the past. I wanted to just mention, however, that when I was in India once, I was working with a company. And at the end of the 10-day consultation, I asked them if they'd seen any miracles in their business. They were pretty fatigued from the 10-day process, so they weren't jumping up and down with excitement. But the guy said, yeah, we've seen miracles. I said, well, can you give me an example? And he said, look, we have a production process, and they were also making silage bags, same as Gunnar Olsen was doing. And so I understood the process a little bit, or at least a description of the process. And what happened was that at the end of the run, there are 3 rollers, and the plastic passes through these rollers, millimeters thick. But at the end of the run, one of the employees would take a scalpel on a stick and just cut the plastic for the end of that particular run. What happened this time, however, was that the employee, instead of going and standing behind the rollers, was a little bit too lazy to walk around and cut the rollers from the other side. And as he put the scalpel up on the stick, the rollers sucked him through, and he went straight through those rollers. Of course, the person was dead. The factory manager was a follower of Jesus, a believer, and went over and prayed for the man, and he revived. He then called the owner of the business, the person with whom I was speaking, and said, look, we've had a terrible accident at the factory. This is what's happened. Please pray. And the owner called his wife, who was also there in the consultation with me. She verified the story, and she called a prayer group because they had a group of intercessors for the business. This is really, really important, to have a group of people who are praying for your business. So they began to pray for this man. They took him to a hospital, and they x-rayed him because clearly his bones would be crushed, not just broken, but crushed. And to their surprise, after the x-ray had been taken, there were no broken bones, nothing. Now remember that he went through these rollers with millimeters of clearance between them, and yet no broken bones. So then the doctors concluded, well, his internal organs must be completely smashed, must be a mess. So they began to do a series of scans. They did the scans, and there was no problem. The only problem the man had was shock. So they kept him overnight in the hospital just to treat him for shock and under observation. And after that he was released, he was fine. We've had other stories as well where God has intervened in terms of the resurrection of people. And I won't go into those except to say that you, as a leader of your business, or somebody who's heading up a department, or somebody who's the head of a household, you can believe God for the well-being of your people. This is an extreme case when somebody needs to be resurrected from the dead. And so I would encourage you that God is the God of resurrection. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead dwells in us. And so we can bring that power to bear on our products, on our businesses, on customer relationships, on product development processes that look like they're broken. We can invite God's presence into those situations. And even praying for people in our household where the situation looks completely hopeless. One of our friends who's been through the Repurposing Business Program had developed a product, and a couple of his engineers were walking through a West African country, to go and install a well in a village. And they saw a procession coming the other way. And they realized when the procession got closer that it was a funeral. And they greeted the people and learned that the wife of a Muslim imam had died. Now, these gentlemen felt prompted to offer to pray. So they offered to pray for not just the imam, but for the wife who was dead. And they prayed for quite a long time. And eventually she sat up and she asked for water. God can do the miraculous. Yes, it's unusual. But the fact is that if God can do that, then our challenges with our products, with our business, our job is not to listen to the tax man, to the accountants, to the economic experts, but to say, God, what are you saying about my product? What are you saying about my business? And then we stand, as Hannes and Unra did, as the young men going on the road to the village did, as others did, and we approach the thing through the eyes of faith. When Jesus went to Mary and Martha's place, and Lazarus was already stinking in the tomb, people, thought this is a stinky dead situation. It's so dead, it stinks. And Jesus came along and spoke life into that situation. Years and years ago, when we had difficulties in our business, I'd gone to a conference, and a woman came up and spoke to me. Her name was Barbara Yoder, and said she sees the word resurrection. Does resurrection mean anything to you? And Lynn said, well, his screensaver says, Lazarus, come forth, which is what Jesus said to Lazarus in the old translations. There's a dead body lying in a tomb, and Jesus says to the dead body, Lazarus, come forth. And so I want to encourage you, as you look at your products, look at your business, look at some countries where you're operating, situations where things are just not running according to your plan, where there's not the life that you would expect. Look him in the eye and say, Lazarus, come forth. Speak life into those things. So I just want to bless you today and pray that your products, your businesses, your dreams, your ideas, some of the things that look stone cold dead, that God would breathe fresh life into those things. And that even now you would stretch out your hand, that you would lay your hands on your products, on your business, on your employees, on your colleagues, and that the life of Jesus Christ, the resurrection life of Jesus Christ, which worked so powerfully 2,000 years ago, would be at work again in your business. So God bless you, and we'll see you next week.